In today's class, we move from the Pentateuch to the historical books. So we're going to a different section of the Old Testament, or of the Law and Prophets, the historical books, which are described in Reading the Bible, RTB, chapter 4. We're not going to do the whole chapter, but only the first section, pages 86 to 98, that focus on one group of historical books known as the Deuteroomistic History. So today's class will look at the Deuteroomistic History, and we'll conclude with one passage from the Deuteroomistic History from the second book of Samuel. First of all, we look at the terms that we use for today's class. This history, written by the Deuteroomistic historians, refers to a particular set of biblical books. It's not all the historical books. So first of all, notice in chapter 4, beginning page 86, which books are the Deuteroomistic historians, the date of composition. Notice also the agenda that you will find on page 89, the purpose or the agenda of the Deuteroomistic historians. All of these 3 points will clarify what we are looking at, what we are studying. And finally, we look at this exercise in disambiguation. In other words, don't get confused with the 4 different words which are very similar but not exactly the same. The Deuteronomist, abbreviated by the letter D, is one of the 4 sources of the Pentateuch in the documentary hypothesis, the J, E, D, and P, the third of the 4 sources of the Pentateuch. The Deuteronomist is found in one of the books of the Pentateuch, the last of the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the book of Deuteronomy, which is abbreviated DT. Then there is the Deuteronomic principle, or sometimes referred to as the Deuteroomistic principle, DP. There is an entry at the back of RTB in the glossary on the Deuteronomic principle. It's also explained in chapter 4. Finally, the DH, the Deuteroomistic history, which are those particular books of the history of Israel referred to as the Deuteroomistic history because they follow the Deuteroomistic principle. So we'll be seeing more of these terms in today's class. Now, the agenda of the Deuteroomistic historian, as you can see there in RTB on page 89, has to do with the great catastrophe that was the loss of the temple, the king, and the land, the promised land of Israel. So we first of all look at the centerpiece, the Temple of Jerusalem, and some of the basic history behind this great temple. This is an image of a reconstruction, an imaginative reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem, built in the city that was first captured by King David about the year 1000 BC, captured from the Jebusites. David turns the city of Jerusalem into his royal city and unites the 12 tribes, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, into one great kingdom. And he brings the Ark of the Covenant as the holy shrine into this city. The Ark of the Covenant was built in the time of Moses, 250 years before the time of David, as the Hebrews fled slavery in Egypt and in the desert built the Ark of the Covenant to carry the tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments. So this was the holy shrine. It was brought into Jerusalem and placed there in a special tent. Then David's son, Solomon, built the temple to house the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies around the year 950, about the same time as the writing of the Yahwist, the J source, according to the documentary history. This temple and also the city of Jerusalem were both destroyed by the Babylonian army under King Nebuchadnezzar in the year 586. This is the great catastrophe referred to by RTB. The temple was destroyed, the city was destroyed, the king was also destroyed, and so the monarchy and the independent nation came to an end. Later on, after the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, the Persian emperor sent several thousand Jewish exiles back to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. The second temple was completed about the year 515 BC. It was then restored by King Herod the Great beginning in the year 19 BC, and it was finally finished in the year 64 AD or CE. 6 years later, in the year 70, the Roman army destroyed the second temple. They also later on in 135 destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and on the same location built a pagan city, Aelia Capitolina. So all of these bullets are part of the great catastrophe, the loss of their own land promised to Abraham, the loss of the temple, the loss of the king. Here we see the Babylonian siege and destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple of Solomon, beginning in the year 586 until the year 538, so some 70 years later, the Persians conquered the Babylonians and sent back several thousand Jewish exiles to rebuild the city. But this period from 586 to 538 is referred to as the Babylonian exile. And it's during this time that the Bible as we know it begins to come into existence. It's during the Babylonian exile that the four sources of the Pentateuch are drawn together, and during and after the exile, the Pentateuch, or Torah, the law of Moses, is finally completed as we know it today. During this same time, the Deuteroomistic History was completed. The Jewish people had one temple for one God, and when that temple was destroyed, there was no more sacrifice, no more traditional worship, and so instead, during the Babylonian exile, they began to build houses of prayer and of study called the synagogues, the beginning of the synagogues, where people would gather on the Sabbath to hear the law and the prophets, the beginning of the Bible, the Torah, the law and the prophets and the writings, to hear them read and to pray about the message of the law and the prophets. And so this is also the beginning of modern Judaism as we know it today. This image shows the destruction of the second temple. There were two Jewish revolts trying to gain their independence from the Roman Empire, and the first revolt was finally quelled in the year 70 AD or CE. This was the end of Temple Judaism. The first temple was destroyed, then rebuilt. Now the second temple is destroyed, and there will be no more temple for the Jewish people, even though in the Jewish synagogue services there will be prayers for the restoration of the temple and lamentation for the loss of the temple. But this is the end of the Jewish faith centered on the temple, the sacrifices of the temple, the feast days, the special pilgrimage feasts to the temple, and the beginning of modern Judaism under the leadership of the rabbis, the teachers of the law, and interpreters of the prophets and the writings. At the same time, after the temple is destroyed, the Jewish followers of Jesus, who see Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the Jewish Christians, begin to develop as a separate religion, beginning as a Jewish movement of renewal. They now become a separate religion, and we see the beginnings of the writings of Jewish Christians that will become the New Testament, the Gospels and the letters. So this slide summarizes the Deuteroomistic history, this collection of books put together during the exile between 586-538, following the agenda of understanding the great catastrophe of 586, the loss of the land, the temple, and the king. Why did this happen? How did this happen? The Deuteroomistic historians in RTB, page 89, are convinced that the reasons for this great catastrophe are not mere chance or the failure of God, but the failure of the people of Israel. According to the Deuteronomic principle, when Israel was faithful to the covenant, they prospered and were blessed. When they were unfaithful to the covenant, they were punished. And when their unfaithfulness finally reached its limit, they were purged from the land by their God. They lost the land, the temple, and the king, and were now called to begin again. So the Deuteronomic principle, this strict correlation between sin and punishment, obedience and reward. The Deuteronomic principle was first developed in the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Pentateuch, which was written about the year 650, and then 200 years later became incorporated into the Pentateuch or the Torah after the return from the exile. The Deuteroomistic history, about this same time, around 550, brings together the many memories and writings of the history of the kings of Israel, the kings of the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, from the time of David and Solomon all the way to the destruction of the kingdom and later the return from the exile. And it tells the story of the history of Israel from a particular bias, a particular point of view. The point of view, the perspective of the Deuteronomic principle. It shows how those kings who were faithful and obedient were blessed and prospered, whereas when kings, the priests, the people were unfaithful, fell into sin, they were punished, and the last and greatest punishment, the loss of the land, the temple, and the king. We conclude today's class with a famous passage which is a clear example of the Deuteroomistic history. This passage is 2 Samuel chapter 11 and chapter 12 about David and Bathsheba. This is part of the Deuteroomistic history, and it's one of the most ancient parts. The Deuteroomistic history was put together in the year 650, but the pieces of this history go back often to much more ancient times. One of the most ancient pieces of the Deuteroomistic history is the section known as the History of Succession to the Throne of David. That is found in 2 Samuel chapters 9 to 20 and 1 Kings, chapters 1 to 2, mentioned in the second chart, chart B, on page 39 in brackets. You'll see a reference to the history of succession to the throne. And we think that this history, these chapters, go back to the time of King Solomon, when many of the people mentioned in these passages are still living or had just died. So it is written during the time of Solomon, who was the son of David, and it's about David and the succession to his throne. In this particular passage, chapter 11 and 12, we see the famous sin of David, the great sex scandal of the reign of King David. David, who had been chosen, anointed by the Lord God, who had prospered, now shows his unfaithfulness. He falls into sin in multiple ways, and we see the consequences of the sin. So open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 11 and read out loud this chapter. And notice in the image on the left we see David in the balcony of his palace. Of course, the royal palace is the highest structure in the city, looking down on the homes that are 1 or 2 stories and the roofs of the homes. And on the roof is where people would take their baths, because it was a private place unless you were looking from the tower of the royal palace. And this chapter tells us that the men of the city were off fighting a battle, and in the battle was also Uriah the Hittite, and David was still at home in the royal palace of Jerusalem. And there he sees the wife of Uriah, Bathsheba. She is very beautiful. She's taking her bath. He is entranced. He gives her a call and says, "Come over for lunch." And so she does. And then when she gets back home a few days later, she sends a message and says, "I'm pregnant." So David has a problem. And we see in chapter 11 how he deals with it. And his first plan, he has 3 different plans. His first plan is to get Uriah to come home and to spend the night with his wife. And so he sends a message to the general fighting the battle, Joab, and asks him to send Uriah, who is his right-hand man, his armor bearer, to come back and give an update on the battle. Joab doesn't know what's going on, but he knows that he needs to send Uriah to give an update. Uriah comes, tells him the battle is going well, and then David encourages Uriah to go back, spend the night with his wife. He sends down a great meal. Instead of rice and beans that everybody's eating, he sends some juicy filet mignon, a nice steaks, wine, so Uriah can enjoy a good evening with his wife. But the spies that David places see that Uriah doesn't not go home. He sleeps out on the steps of the king's palace. He never goes home. And the next day, David asks him, why not? And here we see that Uriah is very faithful. He's a good guy. He doesn't want to take advantage of his trip to Jerusalem to spend time with his wife, to enjoy himself, when all of his buddies are out suffering on the battlefield. So David talks him into staying one more night and goes to plan B. In plan B, David invites Uriah to eat in the royal palace. And there he makes sure to get him drunk, because he knows that if he's drunk, he's liable to do things he would not do when he's sober. And then once again, Uriah, even when he's drunk, does not go home and spend the night with his wife. So finally, David has to go to plan C. and writes a note and gives it to Uriah to carry to the general. Uriah, who probably could not read, carries his own death sentence. The note tells the general to place Uriah in a battle where he is going to get killed. And that's what happens. And then David takes Bathsheba as one of his own wives. In the time of David, kings had several wives, so she joins the harem. She will later become the mother of King Solomon. But in chapter 12, we see the prophet of the royal house, Nathan the prophet, coming to tell David of his sin. And Nathan does not just come in and shout at the king, but he tells him a little story, a parable. So notice this is a literary genre that was often used by Jesus, but the genre of the parable was not something new that Jesus created, but something very ancient, going back to the first and earliest prophets. Nathan's parable, as you read in chapter 12, is about a rich man and a poor man. And the rich man who has all of these flocks of sheep, and a visitor comes, and instead of taking one of his sheep, he takes the one sheep of this poor man who only has one sheep, who is almost like a little pet, that he takes care of this little female sheep, a ewe lamb, and takes that sheep and slaughters it for his dinner. David is enraged. He doesn't realize the parable is really a story about himself. And then Nathan tells him, "You are the man who has been unjust, who has stolen his neighbor's wife, who has lied, cheated, and murdered." And then David repents. But David will face the consequences, and violence will continue to plague the house of David. Later on in 2 Samuel, we see his own sons will rebel against him. And so this little story is not just a sex scandal, a story of the sin of David, but it's also an example, a very good example, of the Deuteronomic principle. And throughout the stories of the Deuteroomistic history, we see many, many, many examples of this strict correlation between sin and punishment, between faithfulness and obedience, and reward and prosperity. When the kings or the people are faithful and obedient, they are blessed with prosperity. When they fall into sin, then they pay the price. And the greatest price is the great catastrophe of the Babylonian exile that leads to the loss of the king, which is their independence, the loss of the temple, and the loss, finally, of their land, the land promised to Abraham, the promised land, a people without their land.